flip-flop. There we go. So this is Sydnee Grushack. She is in New York. So we have some East Coast representation. Where are you all? Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Yes, Massachusetts, Ithaca. So we've got a few East Coast folks. We have been working, and Sydnee will go into it, but we have been working with Eunomia thanks to our funding through the LCCMR grant that we mentioned earlier. We have been working with Eunomia to conduct an impact of reuse study. And we've done this before. We did one a couple of years ago. And actually the PCA, Pollution Control Agency, did one a little over a decade ago. So this is another iteration of that work. There have been some changes in this year. So you'll see those, and we'll talk about why those changes were made, updating models because of outdated data, updating our way we look at the data. But Sydnee and her awesome team have been working on this for the last 4 months, something like that. And we're really excited to hear more. And there will be a report forthcoming after this when it's all crunched and made pretty into a print version or a PDF version that you will all be able to see. But we're excited to have Sydnee here with us today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. Can you hear me okay? Are we all good?
You sound great.
Great. Yeah, so thanks everybody for having me. I'm excited to be here. Sorry I can't be there in person. I tuned in a little bit earlier and saw there's some great presentations happening. So I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Yeah, so as Emily said, I'm Sydnee Grushack. I'm a senior consultant at Eunomia Research and Consulting. And we've been working with Reuse Minnesota on a study to measure the statewide impacts of reuse across Minnesota. So I'm going to go into just a quick intro to Eunomia, talk a little bit about what we're trying to do, some of the complexities of defining reuse and identifying reuse businesses, getting real data that's helping us to identify those impacts, discuss our methodology. And like Emily said, I'll constantly be referencing sort of the 2020 study and the previous studies and how what we've done differs and why. And then talk about our fresh off the presses results. So first look, which we'll eventually be putting into a report in the near future. So quickly, Eunomia Research and Consulting, we are a leading advisor on resource management and the circular economy. So an environmental consulting firm where we're really focusing on waste, recycling, reuse, anything in regards to the circular economy. We've been around since 2001 and have 7 offices across the world, headquartered in the UK. And I'm in our New York office where we cover most of our work across North America. And we really specialize in imparting evidence-led approach with long-standing sector knowledge gained being at the forefront of environmental solutions for decades. So we work with the European Commission in Europe on some of their big single-use plastic directives and waste frameworks that they have there. And we look to bring some of these best practices from Europe to our North American clients and some of those really cutting-edge solutions to waste management and resource management here. So it's been great to really work with Reuse Minnesota. We work across sectors, public, private, and nonprofit. And yeah, our nonprofit clients like Reuse Minnesota are really the ones pushing things forward. So it's been wonderful to work with them. And here's just a little bit of our services that we provide. So like I said, sort of across the space in terms of circular economy, zero waste, we really have a core competency in data modeling to determine like impact analyses of different options and providing policy recommendations. Been working a lot recently on extended producer responsibility as it emerges in the States, conduct life cycle analyses, and yeah, just across sort of the waste hierarchy to reduce waste and pursue a circular economy across the globe. Yeah, and that takes the form of tools like the one we've created for Reuse Minnesota and recommendations, roadmaps, that sort of thing. So for this study, as you all know, Reuse Minnesota works to advance the regenerative business sector in Minnesota by bringing attention to and connecting reuse businesses across the state. So this study is really trying to quantify that impact of the sector and measure the success of current efforts and really provide a baseline against what future efforts can be measured. And like Emily said, we're very grateful to the LCCMR grant for the funding for this work. And also, as Emily mentioned, in 2011, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency conducted sort of the first version of this study, and that was followed up by REUSE Minnesota's study in 2020 with Brio Consulting, which is a consulting and marketing firm, to quantify reuse. And we have used these reports sort of as the basis of our work, with the aim to really refine the methodologies of the previous studies and provide results that are as accurate as possible, and also create a user-friendly tool for REUSE Minnesota where they can use it in the future to provide comparable analyses and really see the change and hopefully the growth of the reuse sector in the future. So this is sort of an overview of how we conducted the study. We spent a lot of time really in these first two tasks looking to really define our methodology, define reuse, put bounds around what are reuse businesses and how do we gather the data around those, and then actually getting the data, refining it, attempting to fill some holes, remove outliers, and then assigning weightings to the data that we received, which I will go into a little bit later. And then we developed a tool, an Excel-based tool based on the US environmentally extended input-output model, which I also will explain further, and integrated this with a nice user interface and something that's very user-friendly to create something that will be able to be replicated and used again in the future. And then the results from this, we're creating a visual narrative where you'll see some of our charts and graphs that came out of here. And like Emily said, this will go into a final report, which will be made public on REUSE Minnesota's website in the very near future. So what is reuse? I think you've all been talking about this all day and think about this very frequently, but we're really trying to determine what this is and how we talk about it in a way that would give us some clear boundaries for determining what's included and what's excluded in this study. And just wanted to note that though recently it's a buzzword and a really hot topic, it's not new, and there's a really established sector and many businesses that fall under the umbrella of reuse across the state and across the country. And here on the right, you can see we have a diagram of the waste hierarchy, and just wanted to note that the EPA places reuse and source reduction atop the waste hierarchy as the preferred methods for managing materials sustainably. So really important to try and know what we're talking about and push for the expansion of this sector. So yeah, wanted to just note that though there's been sort of this recent attention on packaging, and that's really important, what we're talking about in this study is much broader and connected to many industries and products, including repair, rental, sales of used products. And reuse also is very important for the economy. It's really hard to outsource when you're talking about existing products and keeping those in circulation. And this means that jobs are inherently local. So really quantifying the economic impact through this report shows the value of the industry. And yeah, that's what the study is focused on, telling the story of where we are now and looking to see how we can push it forward in the future. So for this study, we went through 30 or 40 definitions of reuse from across policy, nonprofits, and industry groups, and used these definitions to really educate ourselves and inform the study committee, which included my team as well as the REUSE Minnesota board and staff, and focus on sort of decreasing production, so source reduction, and extending life of existing products in pursuing the circular economy. So the definition that we landed on altogether was the continued use, repair, or repurposing of items or materials, which extends the life of resources and decreases the demand for new production. So this was used sort of as our North Star when we were conducting the study. If we ever had sort of a question of, does this count, does this not count? Just going back to the definition and thinking about how the particular business or service fit within this definition. So identifying reused businesses, this was a lengthy process that we went through to ensure that we included basically everything that we could that fell under the umbrella of reuse. And we went through a process of looking at the business categories that were included in the 2 previous studies, then going through all potential other business categories, and those were that fell under NAICS codes, which are the North American Industry Classification System, which I will also discuss on the next slide, and vetting basically, should this industry business type be included? And then it was like a yes, no, maybe, and we used those maybes to create a weighting process based on what the committee felt should be included. So as opposed to the previous 2 studies that it was basically like a yes, no, include, don't include. We tried to create a bit more nuance in the data that we included by including proportions of business revenue associated with certain businesses where we felt a portion of the business could be attributed to reuse, but not the entire thing. So these are an illustration of some of the different business categories that we had the different businesses fall under. And like I said, so NAICS codes were the basis of the data that we used to provide an input to our modeling. So NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System, is the standard used by federal statistical agencies in classifying business establishments for the purposes of collecting and analyzing statistical data related to the US business economy. So it's data that's housed by the federal government, and when businesses register themselves, they essentially indicate their primary and secondary income producing lines of business. And there are over 1,000, I think 1,100 or so business lines to choose from. So they self-classify, and that's what they're classified under. If people want to go in and purchase data and get like all the businesses that fall under one of these NAICS codes, that's how they will appear there. So that's what we did. We went to Dun & Bradstreet, who provides commercial data analysis and insights for businesses, and we purchased about 13,000 the data for about 13,000 businesses across Minnesota that fell under the categories that we thought had some sort of relevance to reuse. And we were able to get the business names, sales data, location data, number of employees, and these self-identified industry classifications, which is formed the basis of our analysis. I do want to acknowledge that there are limitations with this data. First of all, like the self-identification, might not be entirely accurate. We found some things that were classified under categories that didn't seem right at all, but it's the best we could do. And then sometimes incomplete. So some of these categories were not always there. There were definitely gaps in the data, which we tried to fill based on some assumptions and averages, that sort of thing. Occasionally inaccurate matching. So we found some especially egregious instances where, for instance, if there was a business with multiple branches, maybe there were the revenue for the entire business rather than the branch. And then that also created some outliers where for the number of employees, the revenue that was provided seemed completely inaccurate. So we were able to identify those and adjust them. And then also the frequency of updates. So NAICS codes are updated every 5 years, where they essentially reevaluate whether the list of businesses they have is still accurate. So over time, as new business types emerge, they can be included. And businesses also basically are responsible for reporting. So it's not always the data that's the most up to date that's included. There might be businesses included that have closed over time, or certain things like that. So there are limitations to this data. However, when you're trying to get data for 13,000 businesses or businesses across the state, this is basically the best way to do so. And so we used our modeling skills to try and refine this data and get it to be as accurate and reflective of reality as possible. And like I said, we used weightings to do a little more refinement than was done in the previous two studies. And this chart on the right shows a little bit of what we did here. So assigning to the different categories, weightings based on what analysis of the businesses that were included and what we felt could be attributed to reuse of a certain business type. So for example, in the 2020 study, they included some categories of business that they thought that reuse was a significant portion of their revenue, but were not classified strictly as reuse businesses. So for example, bookstores or bicycle shops, which have a large portion of used sales. And in that study, they included essentially the whole revenue associated with those business types, which leads to an overestimation of the revenue there. That study also excluded automotive businesses due to overwhelming revenue impacts, which was sort of a reaction to the 2011 study. And that led to an underestimation by completely removing those business types from the data. So we tried to, as accurately as possible, include everything that we could imagine had to do with reuse according to our definition, and to come up with a way to determine the percentage of the business revenue that could be attributed to reuse. And this is an inexact science. It's a subjective analysis, but we vetted it between our team and REUSE Minnesota and tried to get to a place where we felt very comfortable with the percentages that we included, and in a way that was more accurate than had previously been done. And like I said, there were some refinements that had to be done to the data. So this is an illustration of some of the refinements that were made. So when we first pulled the data for these 13,000 businesses, there was revenue of about $5.6 billion that was shown. And then once we cleaned this, removing the outliers, filling in the blanks, this brought us down to about 4.7. And then once we applied our weightings, this gave us about a little over 3 billion as the weighted revenue going into the model. So can show you, there's a big, doing some of these data refinements and applying the weightings changes the scale of the data that we're including a lot. And we think that this is a more accurate depiction of the actual impact and the associated revenue with reuse across the state than was previously done. And on the right here, you can see we have a table that shows the bounds for removing outliers. So we base this on basically the revenue per employee, and we're able to determine when something fell outside these bounds. We removed that revenue and created a new average based on the industry to try and make this data more accurate. And so that was all the data we gathered, we cleaned, tried to get it as refined as possible, and then we put that data into our tool. And so the tool that we created was based on, like I said, the US Environmentally Extended Input-Output model. And this is a model that was created by the US EPA and is used to look at the economic impacts, the association between economic impacts and environmental data for a variety of US goods and services. So it basically creates what are called emissions factors based on life cycle analysis. So there's been a lot of science done on what's the environmental impact of like building a sofa or providing a car rental or something like that. So this model has all those emissions factors in there, which we were able to leverage and compare against the business data that we purchased and cleaned. And on the left here are just some examples of how this data has been used by others. So used to assess the environmental economic impacts associated with recycling for the EPA's Recycling Economic Information Report, used by Amazon to calculate their carbon footprint, used by local county in California to create a purchasing guide based on how environmentally friendly are certain products versus others, and so on. So really a wide range of applications for this model. And yeah, we feel like this is probably the most accurate model that exists of this type. And that is to say, this is a different model than was used in the previous two studies. So those studies used the Carnegie Mellon EIO LCA model, so Economic Input Output Life Cycle Assessment model. These two models are pretty comparable. The Carnegie Mellon was the original, so the kind of OG, and when the 2011 report was created, I believe the US EIO model did not exist yet. However, the US EIO model tries to improve upon this Carnegie Mellon model, and for us, it was especially important that it's compatible with Excel, so it makes it a lot easier to use. And like I said, we can create a user interface which will allow REUSE Minnesota to take this model and reuse it in the future and be able to input new data that can be comparable to the data that we analyzed this year. Also has a little bit of some more specificity in terms of those emissions factors, has a wider variety of types in terms of actual gases like greenhouse gases that are being measured. And it's more up to date. So the baseline data included in the model is of a more recent year, and it continues to be updated. And while the Carnegie Mellon model is still accurate and people still use this model, it's basically the same as having a piece of software or like an iPhone that's from 8 years ago, still works, but you're not going to get the recent updates. So yeah, we thought that the US EIO model would be preferable for REUSE Minnesota going forward. This complicated diagram is showing how our model works. So the process to actually get the data and put it in, clean it, and actually produce the results. So the black boxes are each of the input data sets. So this is the NAICS code, data that went in. So the actual business data, excluded the outliers, extrapolated where there were blanks, applied the weightings. And then over here, we have the process that was used to apply the emissions factors. So did a little bit of cross-checking with the Carnegie Mellon, made sure that inflation was applied, and all went to input on to make the emissions factors up to date and comparable to the year that the business data was from. And then put those together to produce the results. And so here are our first results. So our headline of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions avoided per year is about 455,000, which is the equivalent of removing 98,000 cars per year off the road. So that is a huge number and very exciting. Really shows that the reuse industry is substantial and has a great impact across the state. When we put this into context a little bit, here on the right shows that the US emissions as a whole, about 5.2 trillion. In Minnesota, about 160 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent produced per year. And yeah, so small percentage, we're at 0.28% of Minnesota statewide emissions, but significant. And as the sector continues to grow, hopefully that emissions avoided will increase. I do want to note that from the 2020 study, this was a large change. It's about 84% lower than the emissions that were calculated for that study. But I'll get into this a little bit more in a minute. But again, that's sort of related to the weightings that were applied, really bringing down the revenue due to some of that cleaning and removing outliers. And also the different model that was used to produce some different results. So I'll show you in a couple of minutes a little bit of a sensitivity matrix and how that can vary based on what you're using. So if we go into industries, this shows the emissions by industry type. So some of those large categories that we had. The blue line here is the total revenue associated with each of these sectors. And then the orange line is the sum of the greenhouse gas emissions avoided from each sector. So basically the difference between the line and the bar under each category is like the intensity of emissions per dollar that comes from each of these sectors. Yeah, so a little hard to understand, but can give you a sense of basically the impact from each of these sectors. And if we break it down further, so like I said before, there are over 1,000 NAICS codes. We had data from about 160 of these different sectors included in some way. So this graphed all the way down on the left is the total of all of those sectors. Obviously, most of them have probably only a small number of businesses or a small amount of revenue included. So really concentrated at the top here. So we zoom into some of these highest NAICS code industries. And you can see some of the top here are ones that would have the greatest revenue and therefore the greatest emissions as being a contributor to emissions reductions in the state. So rental of commercial equipment, it's a high priced, complex goods. So renting it really reduces emissions a lot. And used car dealers, we have some additional rental, furniture repair, pretty high. Yeah, and so you can just take a look and we'll get into a little bit more analysis of this in the report, but you can see some of the highest performing sectors there in terms of emissions reductions. And then if we do an analysis by region, you can see as sort of expected, the metro area contributes sort of the most as it has the highest proportion of business activity across the state. However, pretty significant representation from all the other regions as well, but interesting to see the comparison there. This is based on a state breakdown of regions. And then this is a sensitivity matrix of the results. So like I sort of said, it's difficult to know the emissions associated with each of those goods and services. The US EEIO conducted LCA life cycle assessments on products, but this shows the spread of possibilities basically based on the unknowns. So the complexity of trying to determine the carbon footprint of one product or service. And this is trying to do it for an entire industry, a whole suite of industries, really. So what you're looking at here across the top is the average kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per dollar. So based on the intensity of that estimate of like how much emissions are reduced per dollar spent on a goods or service. And then down the side here are the weightings. So the different weightings that we applied to the different industries. So depending on the weighting and the revenue that you include makes a huge difference as well on the total emissions avoided. So our estimate based on the model and the weightings that we applied is pretty conservative. This box is the closest to where we are. So an average of approximately 65% of the business revenue in total. And then you can see if we had used sort of the Carnegie Mellon factors, which again are sort of less specific to some of the goods and services, puts you over here in this box. And so that's if we had used those with the same weightings. And this was just useful for us to compare and see sort of why there was that big spread between the previous study and our study. And then this box here, down here, the blue box, is if we had used the same weightings. So as the previous study, which essentially is 100%, where we would have been in comparison. So gives us a sense of, what made the difference? Why are we lower than the previous study? And what is that attributable to? And yeah, it provides sort of a sense of this is the range that you could calculate these things at, and we are being as accurate as possible within that range. And then jobs. So like I said earlier, this is something that is a lot easier to calculate currently, but reuse is hugely important across Minnesota, creates about 36,000 jobs based on our estimates across the state. And this is sort of a breakdown again of the different industry categories and regions in which those fall. So really interesting to be able to see sort of the scale of some of the different industries and how the spread falls in terms of the impact of reuse economically across the state. So that is where we are, still doing some analysis on some of those results, but at the high level, you can see that reuse is a varied and significant part of the state economy, and that having a consistent definition and data is especially important. And across that sort of sensitivity matrix, it's really important if you're trying to compare between years or between jurisdictions that you're using the same bounds. So having the same bounds on the reuse businesses is necessary to accurately compare, and it's difficult to do. And better business data could make this more accurate in the future. So the tool that we've developed is pretty flexible. You can put in new NAICS code data and apply the same bounds that we did. You can change the weightings, you can change the emissions factors. When the new NAICS codes come out, they can be mapped towards these old ones. So it allows for growth basically in the future. And we think that using a tool that allows for sort of this nuance is key and will allow, as data becomes better and as reuse becomes a larger part of the economy, it will allow us to readjust and measure that in the future. So we think that this tool will allow Reuse Minnesota to be able to track the impact of the sector going forward to the best extent that we can, and recognizing that there are still limitations, but that as you try and refine and continue to improve methodologies, yeah, you can see even clearer the impact that's possible. And so the goal was really to try and get the best data and the best results that we can now so that we can see it in the future, and that REUSE Minnesota can be a leader across the country in doing this type of work and in pushing the conversation forward. So we look forward to continuing to support that and to seeing where things go. And yeah, that is it.